thanks of all for coming to listen to my talk today. And yeah, as I said, I will, for reasons of time, I will mostly focus on Zeta and hopefully touch quickly on von Steinecker in the end, but I'm also happy to answer questions on that if anyone is particularly interested in von Steinecker. So first of all, why compare Haushofer with these two novels? And for once, there are some fairly direct intertextual references in the latter two novels to Haushofer's Die Wand. But my bigger interest in this is that all three novels depict a tension between nature and technology, which are both presented as destructive and soothing forces on the protagonist's lonely bodies, which can bring both happiness and pain. And I will first show how kind of debates on nature and culture, technology resonate in Die Wand with a short references to Freud and Nietzsche, and then debate Die Wand within the context of Feybound Alberti's notion of embodied loneliness, and eventually the protagonist's loneliness, be it forced or chosen, relentlessly exposes the protagonist's bodies to nature's and technology's overpowering forces. So I would say we've debated this already yesterday, but potentially three kind of explanations for the wall. So particularly in the earlier periods of scholarship, there were a lot of psychoanalytical readings of Die Wand. Then in the text, Die Wand actually appears on the 30th of April and the night to the 1st of May. So the Walpurgisnacht, which opens up this whole possibility of like magical realism. And maybe someone more versed than I am in these periods could actually read this in comparison with other famous Walpurgisnächte, as in Goethe or Karl Kraus, for example. And then there's the explanation that the narrator herself deems the most likely, which is that the Wand is a technologically developed weapon. And so whereas technology in Die Wand fails to provide lust and to tame nature in order to guarantee the safety of human beings, so this is kind of what Freud says in Das Unbehagen in der Kultur, that people are striving towards lust and try to avoid unlust, so pain and suffering. And that kind of technology is kind of one remedy in this, potentially, as it can tame and control nature and make people's lives safer. But indeed, technology, if we follow this assumption of the narrator, establishes the post-apocalyptical setting of the novel. And then the retranslation of the narrator into nature is the basis for the narrator's joy on the Alm, which also contrasts to the harsher natural surroundings down in the valley. And this retranslation into nature, so the Zurückübersetzung des Menschen in die Natur, is, I take from Nietzsche's notion of the Homo Natura. And here I will follow Vanessa Lem's reading of Nietzsche when she says that kind of this retranslation into nature also reestablishes the body as a source of knowledge, and that this retranslation into nature guarantees for like future developments and renewals. So in general, Die Wand establishes the human strive for destruction and death for kind of victorious over its opponent, the Eros, as we have in Freud, with the wall being the final manifestation of its victory. So the narrator makes the triebhafte Wissbegier of the scientist that created the wall responsible for the victory of destruction and death over love. However, this is not so much due to the overwhelming power of the Destruktionstrieb, but rather due to humans' inability to love. So she says, wären alle Menschen von meiner Art gewesen, hätte es nie eine Wand gegeben. Aber ich verstehe, warum die anderen immer in der Übermacht waren. Lieben und für ein anderes Wesen sorgen ist ein sehr mühsames Geschäft und viel schwerer als zu töten und zu zerstören. And the exception to this is, of course, the narrator whose trieb for love has supposedly been eingepflanzt, bestowing her with the capacity for empathy, care, and love that hints at the possibility of a lonely but constantly renewing retranslated life into nature once all other human beings and most of their cultural efforts are gone. And then just to elaborate a bit on this bodily knowledge of the body as well. So on the one hand, of course, Margaret Littler in her early work on Die Wand states rightly that the body in the novel functions as an irreducible site of suffering that retains memory even when the mind doesn't remember this suffering anymore. And indeed, kind of if we think about the pains that the narrator endures when she's laboring to provide for herself and her animals, and as also considering suicide at the time, this is quite clear. But however, I think that also the knowledge of the body goes beyond suffering and trauma. So she repeatedly states that in nature, education and reason hardly have any importance in her struggle to survive, but it is indeed the knowledge of the body that helps her cope with the situation. So one example is when she's learning to or trying to make the firewood. After a while she says, begriff ich endlich, das heißt meine Hände, Arme und Schultern begriffen, und plötzlich war es, als hätte ich mein Leben lang nur Holz gesägt. And also this bodily knowledge refers to her first attempt to making sense of the wall. With the wall being invisible, reason fails her in her attempt to understand the wall during her first encounter with it. She says, ich versuchte zu überlegen, es gelang mir nicht. Her own and Lux's body, however, have already generated the knowledge and carry indisputable signs of the wall's existence. Da war Lux mit seinem blutenden Maul und da war die Beule auf meiner Stirn, die anfing zu schmerzen. Overall, the novel, in a reversal of the Cartesian tradition, privileges physical knowledge over the knowledge of the mind, both in generating knowledge and in forgetting. The body is decisive in the narrator's understanding that her previous life has come to an end and that she will have to endure isolation and loneliness. Erst wenn das Wissen eine Sache sich langsam im ganzen Körper ausbreitet, weiß man wirklich. In terms of forgetting, it is true that while the narrator's body rather memorizes trauma, it tends to forget moments of happiness, such as the summer on the Alm. Ich spüre nicht mehr, wie schön es war. Ich weiß es nur noch. Das ist ein schrecklicher Unterschied. Hence, physical knowledge helps her to survive on a daily basis. Its tendency to remember trauma rather than happiness, however, increases her experience of pain and suffering and deteriorates her mental state. And here one could now also talk about these processes of renewal, but we've touched upon this in the last couple of days when she's kind of developing this more hybrid gender identity that also can change quite quickly, and that she is actually just before hineinwachsen in eine neue Ordnung. But we've touched upon this in the last couple of days already, so I will skip this for now. So now embodied loneliness, and here Bound-Alberti in the biography of loneliness indicates that this notion of embodied loneliness indicates a shift back to the pre-Cartesian era, in which the mind and the body were not separated and emotions regarded holistically. And she emphasizes the importance of the bodily and material cultures of loneliness. And here I would like to first talk about the narrator's report. And in their study of loneliness around 1800, for example, Leider and Jan Assmann speak of writing as a medium einer Ersatzkommunikation, which replaces the more natural and easier communication with people. And I would say that indeed the narrator's Bericht functions as a Ersatzkommunikation after the death of Lux in Stier, but the circumstances of, as well as the motivations for writing and her perceived audience differ quite strikingly from the concept of loneliness in nature as sources of inspiration around 1800. The narrator's loneliness is an enforced and permanent state, and the Bericht emphasizes the dangerous, brutal, and death-bringing side of nature that's, for example, in the Romantic literature was counteracted by the notion of the creative refuge of Mother Nature. Tellingly, the one summer on the Alm, when she's experiencing the soothing solitude of nature, albeit tainted, of course, by the constant fear of danger arising from her potentially being too careless, is the only time when she does not continue her notes. So eventually it is rather the trauma of loss, the pathological side of loneliness, and the challenging seasonal conditions that initiate her writing. Here I put the quote for you to read. So writing the report fulfills more therapeutical purpose to maintain the narrator's mental sanity in isolation and to alleviate fear and anxiety. And instead, we already talked to adhere to what is human in her in the last couple of days. The once narrator initially writes a report without entering a fictional dialogue with an imagined audience, not only being lonely in the writing process, but also preventing the connection with a future readership. However, this changes at one point throughout the narrative when she said that her Herz klopfte rascher when she's thinking that humans' eyes would rest on her writing, and that eventually actually human hands would touch the paper, and that thinking about writing for humans actually makes it easier for her to write. And in this whole passage, the physicality of the description is quite striking. Also, when one thinks, of course, of that she is actually writing by hand, and then kind of imagining that the paper will eventually be touched by hands. And hands are actually we also had this in Emily's paper yesterday, such a huge aspect throughout the whole novel. And so basically, when she's thinking about that her report eventually could be found, this causes a strong physical reaction of the narrator's heart. So writing for a human audience, or at least thinking about this, on the one hand helps her to tackle her mental blockade caused by the trauma and pathological loneliness. And on the other hand, establishes kind of the paper on which the report is written as a mediator of touch, in kind of also trying to treat the narrator's physical loneliness. Thus, in writing her report, she creates an imaginary do, and thus imagines passing on the paper. Through passing on the paper, she imagines a fictional dialogue with an imagined reader as proxy for physical and mental human connection in order to alleviate her writing process, working with her trauma and her loneliness. And we talked a lot about like Anna, and also talked about the animals a lot yesterday. So quickly, I think there's something similar going on in terms of embodied loneliness when we talk about the animals, who we already said in a very complex kind of process. The narrator is more retranslated into the nature, and the animals at times are anthropomorphized. And quickly focusing on looks here. So he is, at least in this imagining, which we discussed very fascinatingly yesterday, bestowed with the ability to comprehend language and to feel empathy. Lux stand mir am nächsten, er war bald nicht nur mein Hund, sondern mein Freund, mein einziger Freund in einer Welt der Mühen und Einsamkeit. Er verstand alles, was ich sagte, wusste, ob ich traurig oder heiter war, und versuchte auf eine einfache Art, mich zu trösten. So, and while Lux perceived the ability to communicate and to react to the narrator's needs alleviates the loneliness of the narrator's mind, touching him provides a remedy for a physical loneliness. When she's reflecting on the cat, mostly avoiding physical contact with her, but the cat is very interesting here because also their relationship functions a lot through touch as well. And it's probably more complex than that. So she states, das Schlimmste ist, dass ich mich ohne Lux wirklich allein fühle. So hence Lux can provide a unity between a mental and physical connection and a remedy for the narrator's embodied loneliness. So now I move on to Seethaler, and I just wanted to show you the covers. I think they're interesting on the one hand that the German cover on the left-hand side has kind of this romantic imagery from like portraying the protagonist from the back that we discussed about with Caspar David Friedrich yesterday as well. And indeed, the recently published New English edition, the cover reminds me a lot of kind of the Alm setting of Die Wand as well, just as a quick note. But kind of about halfway through the novel, there is a quite explicit reference, I would say, to Die Wand. So just after the avalanche has killed Egger's fiancé, he says, für einen Moment hatte das Gefühl, der letzte Mensch auf Erden zu sein, zumindest aber der letzte Mensch im Tal. Er musste lachen, so ein Blödsinn, sagte und ging weiter. So the reference to Haushofer's Wand is implicit but clear, as Eggers considers a similar post-catastrophe scenario in which the narrator of Die Wand finds herself in, losing loved ones and being completely isolated in nature. So Egger rejects this scenario as nonsense, and this sets the approach of Seethaler's engagement with Haushofer, which with Harold Bloom's anxiety of influence can be described as misreading her in order to create imaginative space for himself. So Egger is not kind of entrapped by like a physical barrier in this valley, but he rather seems to be bound to the valley by a mix of deep affinity with nature and a fear of what lies beyond. The novel traces the technological innovations over several decades of the 20th century And the valley becomes more and more technologized during this period, which sets up a conflict between nature and technology, like in Divan. And all of these forces are leaving their marks on Egger's lonely body. So Egger is an illegitimate son and reluctantly adopted by his mother's brother-in-law. And so here he is already isolated by a process of othering from early on in his childhood. His place within the family is not based on social bonds or affection, but solely on money, which leaves him lonely, albeit being surrounded by other people. A loneliness that goes so far that he is dehumanized as a Geschöpf and stripped of his humanity. One effect is that he hardly speaks, which makes it logical that the body, rather than reasonable verbal expression, is his main way to communicate, and that other than the protagonist in Divan, he is also not the first person narrator of the novel. The second effect is that his childhood isolation and mistreatment stems from the physical violence that leads to an exclusion that will mark him out from the people in the valley long after he has emancipated himself from the violent farmer because of his physical strength. His whole childhood trauma had been ingrained in his body by the whip of his adoptive father, the farmer, and whilst his mind forgets the traumatic experiences on the farm, his body, as site of suffering, saves this memory visibly through his limb, which is equally uncurable and has to be adapted to as Divan's narrator's pain in her legs. The physical suffering then serves as a further means for the inhabitants of the valley to exclude him by derogatorily calling him, for example, hinkender Teufel or Hinker. Throughout the novel, there are really only a few moments in which Egger feels that he belongs with the other people in the valley. And interestingly enough, all of these are in some way associated with technological process. The first is when the cableway company arrives and he feels reluctant and kind of a bit wary of technology arriving, but then kind of the urge to join in is so strong that he cheers with them. It is different in the second time when they actually finish the first funicular, and Egger, as part of the company who built this, actually feels that he's belonging to the people and also to the bigger process of human progress through technology. And the last moment is when he's watching the moon landing on TV with the other villagers, and already shows that TV has, because it doesn't really know how to behave towards the TV and also with the other people in the room, that also television has kind of generated new forms of social behavior. And whilst watching the moon landing, Egger says, or the narrator says, fühlte sich den Dorfbewohnern hier unten auf der nachtdunklen Erde auf geheimnisvolle Weise nah und verbunden. Eventually, however, for Egger, these brief moments of happiness and belonging remain temporary, and in the Freudian terminology, a billiges Vergnügen that does not allow Egger to form more permanent social bonds. So the one real connection Egger has with in his life is that with his fiancée Marie. But this is equally associated with both happiness and suffering as the narrators of Divan's relationship with the animals. And what is striking is that it is mostly based on bodily sensations and sexual pleasure. So when she first touches him, when she's waiting on him in the pub, he says that he feels the pain sinking into his flesh deeper and deeper, and that this is immediately compared with like this childhood trauma of being beaten by his adoptive father. And this already sets up kind of the strive for love and the strive for destruction, very close competition. So in contrast to Divan, the ability to love, however, doesn't seem to appear to be eingepflanzt here from the beginning of Egger's life, at least not that he's aware of it. Although one could think about the implications also of gender here, because we talked about this with relation to Divan's narrator the last couple of days. But similarly to the pain inflicted by the farmer's whip, this rather seems to be induced into the body through human touch, and therefore one can probably less speak of a strive than of a socially acquired and learned condition. And the body, again, is set up here as a site of trauma and a site of love. And it is striking that also the body functions mostly as the means of a cure for Egger's loneliness. So at the one hand, kind of the physical reaction he has when he is no longer lonely says that it's warming him from the inside. And on the other hand, the physical presence of Marie In Egger's ever greater knowledge about the unbegreifliches Wunder of her body is the main cure of his loneliness, when it quite strikingly says, Eggers Nächte waren nun nicht länger einsam. The knowledge of and through the body becomes Egger's main remedy for loneliness, indicating a shift towards the more contemporary understanding of loneliness and embodied. And here, kind of because Marie is killed by the avalanche, the struggle between nature and technology becomes striking again. So I already said that the cableway, when this arrived, Egger was very wary of it. But on the other hand, he also describes the mountains as etwas so Schönes und gleichzeitig so furchteinflößendes. So both are potentially portrayed as threatening. And whereas kind of in the Wand, if we follow this reading again after the initial catastrophe, technology is not so much the main source for the narrator's suffering. The continuous contest between the two is far more prominent in Ein ganzes Leben. And Egger is kind of first sets himself up in competition to nature as he's working for the cableway company. And nature is initially described as fragile, it can break like porcelain, and that actually the work leaves deep scars in nature. But then nature is striking back, it's amputating a worker's arm, and nature is anthropomorphized when Egger actually says that you can hear the mountains sing just before the avalanche goes down. And the avalanche is also quite strikingly directed directly at the camp of the headquarters of the company, but stops right before. And so one could argue that maybe technology is in a way more superior, but it's not quite as clear-cut in the whole novel. Also because there is at least the possibility, because people hear an explosion right before the avalanche goes down, that this was actually caused by the company, which also Eggers boss tells him to forget, except, oder glaubst du vielleicht, dass der Berg ein Gedächtnis hat? So bestowing the mountain with a memory here refers back to the mountain potentially having the ability to sing, and establishes a conscious nature that has the agency to resist being subjugated by human culture and technology. So in the end, no matter whether it is nature or an explosion that directly caused the avalanche, the main culprit here is humans' endeavor to control nature in the first place rather than living in symbiosis with it. And so in the later parts of his life, Egger, more in the sense of Nietzsche's Homo Natura, kind of becomes retranslated into nature. The more technologically developed the valley and the world as a whole get, the more Egger, who in younger years helped the technological process, is alienated by it. And the more he's retranslated into nature with the striking symbol of the flowers having reclaimed the former site where the headquarters of the company was, the more content he gets with his situation, and also his loneliness is cured. So whilst his initial fear that the noise coming to the valley with the company might never cease has become a reality, Egger's retreat into the loneliness of nature, in contrast to Haushofer's novel, does not mean a struggle for survival, but provides him with the resources he requires so that taking the edge out of nature and his retranslation into nature much more resembles the soothing and nurturing romantic Waldeinsamkeit. And this is where I stop mostly, just quickly saying what I wanted to talk about von Steinegger is that Steinegger, so there is one passage in Haushofer when she says that the Paradies could only lie outside of nature because of all the struggle she has. And indeed, in von Steinegger, the setting, Alm setting, which reminds us of Haushofer, is a completely technologically created space that kind of pretends to be nature. So it's completely controlled. In this sense, it's kind of referring to this concrete quote from Haushofer. And then also, of course, the protagonists are going through the wall eventually into like a radioactive wasteland, which also made me reconsider in how far also the place within the Wand is not only a prison, but maybe also providing the sense of protection that we talked about yesterday. And then eventually, through even the narrator protagonist being revealed as a technological clone eventually, kind of this question about retranslation into nature actually goes the other way, because we have like this in a bit of a different way, because towards the human, because the narrator wants to be recognized as a human being, and in this sense also the transcendental component of God in connecting the clones. So with Lord, as it says here, it becomes important again. Okay, so thank you very much.
So my starting point for the paper, and firstly, thank you all for staying with it. It's tough to be one of the last, and there's so much to think about over the last few days. So I'm really looking forward to the discussion. So the starting point is to read Haushofer's Die Wand as a text of the Great Acceleration. And so this is an outline of the paper: the Great Acceleration, Metabolic Rift, Freedoms Behind the Wall, Metabolic Reading, Circular Economies, and Rethinking Sisyphus in the Anthropocene. The Great Acceleration refers to the exponential increase in human enterprise and its impacts on the Earth system in recent times. Here I'm quoting from research published by the Stockholm Resilience Centre. What is apparent is the synchronous acceleration of trends from the 1950s to the present day over a single human lifetime, with little sign of abatement. Changes in human production and consumption are reflected in changes in the Earth's natural systems: climate, ocean acidification, terrestrial biosphere degradation, and so on. And these changes are visualized on the right-hand side in those graphs. Another way of visualizing this situation is the famous donut graph of Rockström et al. This graph from 2009, and there have been updated graphs ever since, shows the breaching of what the authors call the safe operating space for humanity in a number of areas, again, including climate change, ocean acidification, and biodiversity loss. Those of us as literary scholars to whom words speak louder than graphs might refer to the pairing of the noun future with the adjective ghastly in a recent scientific journal article. This is our context. How does this context inform our reading of Die Wand? And how might Die Wand be read as a response to this context? Reading Die Wand as a text of the Great Acceleration reveals the protagonist's life as a process of metabolic transformation and directs our attention to the larger energetic and material flows and systems in which human metabolism is caught up. In the novel, the mysterious wall creates a rift between the protagonist and the world from which she is henceforth exiled. The plot device of the wall creating one rift enables another more fundamental rift to come into view, the metabolic rift. Sorry, Mr. Chairman, I have to bring it back. It's disappeared. There we are. Yeah. So can you see that? Hopefully fine. The term metabolic rift is used by ecological Marxist thinkers to refer to the rupture which Karl Marx theorized between humanity and the rest of nature. A rupture emanating from and progressively exacerbated by capitalist agricultural production and the growing division between town and country. In this context, an expanded understanding of metabolism is used. Stoffwechsel refers not only to material exchanges in the body and to the biochemical processes of natural systems, but to social metabolism, which includes the appropriation of nature through human labor in order to satisfy human needs. We touched on the theme of labour yesterday in the discussion following Margaret Littler's talk. A statistical analysis of Die Wand, were one inclined to undertake such an analysis, would probably reveal a high frequency of the word Arbeit. The repetitive nature of the narrative and its stylistic restraint reflect the cyclical processes of expending and replenishing energy in order to undertake the work required to keep going. Above all else, this is a story about the repetitive labour involved in staying alive. Whenever the protagonist is not working, she is resting in order to be able to work. This prompts my effort to read the novel through theories of work, labour, and energy, understood as the capacity to perform work. Theories of social metabolism and the metabolic rift take the familiar Marxist concerns with inquiring into the material conditions of human social life and relations of production as their starting point, and go on to develop an intensified concern often sidelined in classical Marxism, with the metabolic dependency of cities upon the surrounding countryside and with the waste flows and resource flows between city and countryside. Ecological Marxists have often commented critically on what they call the profound anti-urban sentiment that characterizes the environmental movement. This anti-urban sentiment figures the city as a parasite or thief living off the back of the countryside. The ruralist back to the land strand of environmentalism is a neo-romantic refiguring of the materialist Marxist analysis. Quoting here, the nutrients of the soil were sent to cities in the form of agricultural produce, but these same nutrients in the form of human and animal waste were not returned to the land. So this is the rift. There was just a one-way movement robbing of the soil in order to maintain the socioeconomic reproduction of society. End quote. In the face of accelerating ecological destabilization, eco-urbanism now attempts to reimagine the city in a way that might heal the metabolic rift. Quote, eco-urban sites would re-internalize their own resources and recirculate wastes. The goal is autarky and greater ecological and infrastructural self-reliance through closed-loop systems that reduce reliance on external networks. Die Wand is the story of a city dweller who has been catapulted into living directly off the land. What's striking about Haushofer's novel in the context of the Great Acceleration is its persistent refusal to portray life on the land as any kind of idyll, despite and alongside its clearly articulated criticism of the civilization that preceded and was therefore responsible for the advent of the mysterious wall. Until the catastrophic appearance of the wall, Hugo and Louise's hunting lodge, which repurposes the countryside as the playground of the urban upper middle class, belongs to the story of the Metabolic Rift. The novel imagines the abrupt creation of a closed or circular sustenance economy in which the Metabolic Rift is undone or reversed. But because the narrating subject is herself a product of the world of the Metabolic Rift, this reversal can only ever be partial, a situation which creates the melancholy dissonance that characterizes the novel. The metabolic reading of a literary text draws not only on the ecological Marxist theories of the Metabolic Rift, which I've just mentioned, but also on the work of scholars such as Dominic Boyer, Imre Seyman, Patricia Jaeger, Heidi Scott, and others who are shaping the field of energy humanities and developing ways to read for energy in the context of the Anthropocene. Just as we have, and it's really been so heartening to hear this over the last few days, because I feel this is a community that really has learned to read for gender, concerns so much of the work that we do. So we learn to read for gender, approaching literary texts with an eye to what they can tell us about sex-gender systems, past and present, through their possibilities of representation, their critical and utopian perspectives, and their estrangement of discourse. In similar fashion, the energy humanities develop ways of reading metabolically or reading for energy in order to become more fully aware of the extent to which our contemporary energy dilemmas are fundamentally problems of ethics, habits, values, and beliefs. And this last phrase is a quote from Boyer and Seyman, 2014. Haushofer's Die Wand is receptive to a metabolic reading for a number of reasons. First, while it narrates an abrupt transition, or better, ejection from a fossil fuel economy to one powered by wood, it refuses to narrate this rupture in unambivalent terms of loss or gain. If we agree with Deepesh Chakrabarty that one of the most troubling or wicked aspects of our current energy crisis is that, in his often quoted phrase, the mansion of modern freedoms stands on an ever-expanding base of fossil fuel use, and that the urgently necessary transformation of our energy systems may therefore come with a high risk to these freedoms, one might expect a text narrating abrupt return to a wood-fueled subsistence economy to pose the contrast between before and after in terms of the earlier presence and subsequent absence of freedom. But this is not the case. The protagonist may dream vividly of Baroque palaces to a soundtrack of Eine kleine Nachtmusik, but she does not remember her earlier life as a life of freedoms that have now been taken away from her through the advent of the wall and the loss of modernity. Die Katastrophe hatte mir eine große Verantwortung abgenommen. Und ohne dass ich es sogleich merkte, eine neue Last auferlegt. As Daniele Striegel has put it, die Katastrophe greift in Wahrheit korrigierend in ihr Leben ein und befreit sie von den Zwängen der Fremdbestimmung. This release from the constraints of heteronomy is, however, not a release into autonomy. The narrative is not one of growing Selbstbestimmung, but rather Bestimmung durch die Natur, accompanied by self-transformation or indeed loss of self. But while the wall literally holds the protagonist captive in her Waldgefängnis, and the burden of care for herself and her companion animals occupies almost all of her waking hours and thoughts, her new life simultaneously liberates her from other kinds of constraint and restraint, from the gendered, social, and familial obligations of her previous life, from the standardized measurement of time, which we discussed yesterday, the shift from Menschenzeit to Krähenzeit, from boredom, and from illusion. I'm particularly interested in the circulation of the word Wirklichkeit in the novel in this context. Page 1723 is an instance. Wirklichkeit is juxtaposed with what she calls the Abklatsch of her previous heteronymous existence in the city. What is at stake in the novel, then, is not so much a contrast between greater conditions of greater or lesser freedom. What may be at stake in a metabolic reading is to determine what keeps the protagonist going, to attend to what she has to do to reproduce her own life and that of the creatures entrusted to her. And this word entrusted, anvertraut, mir anvertraut is, it will come back at the end of my paper. And also to understand, a metabolic reading seeks to understand the abrupt transition from one energy regime to another in terms of its effect and implications for the protagonist. If, in Heidi Scott's phrase, our life in the oil age entails the gradual metamorphosis of human beings from animal to enhanced petro-animal, Divand imagines the reversal of this metamorphosis and the immense demands of adjusting as a modern human subject to an energy-sparse regime. A metabolic reading starts very simply, asking, what is the energy regime here? Where does the human protagonist get her energy from? What does she expend it on? What forms and sources of energy are depicted and how do they interrelate? When they are depleted, can they be replenished? The narrator lives on a simple diet, often described with the adjective eintönig, of potatoes, beans, apples, crab apples, that's the Holzäpfel, milk and venison, supplemented occasionally by nettles, of which more later, cranberries, raspberries, and trout. Early on in her new life, she finds leftovers in alpine huts, including a sack of flour and a mouldy sausage, but she leaves the sausage to its fate and the flour is soon used up. She does not know enough about mushrooms to feel safe gathering and eating them. Here we are reminded of the role of mushrooms in other eco-dystopias and post-apocalyptic narratives. In Cormac McCarthy's The Road, morels, a kind of mushroom, are the only growing food consumed by father and son. Everything else is from found packets, tins, and drinks machines, and unlike many of the other inhabitants of the dead earth, they refrain from cannibalism. In Margaret Atwood's The Year of the Flood, the second volume of her Mad Adam trilogy, the knowledge of mushrooms is carefully passed down from an older woman to the female protagonist. Mycological lore here, as also in Anna Tsing's non-fiction essay, The Mushroom at the End of the World, is a cultural legacy precariously transmitted among the ruins of capitalism. The mushroom motif picks up on the important question Marlen Haushofer raised in yesterday's discussion around the seeming absence of decay in Divand. And while I would agree that detailed descriptions of processes of decay are largely missing from the Bericht, the fact that the novel depicts a closed or circular economy means that these processes are implicitly present rather than forcibly abjected or externalized. Mushrooms are the principal decomposers in ecological systems. Of der Abhang hinter dem Stall we learn that weißliche Schwämme wuchsen dort und es roch immer ein wenig modrig. And here on the next slide, the third quote there, we read, was mich wirklich berührt, ist immer noch das Gleiche wie früher, Geburt, Tod, die Jahreszeiten, Wachstum und Verfall. But it's true, it's not a main focus of the narrative, and neither is the question of what becomes of her own waste in this circular economy. For warmth and cooking, Haushofer's protagonist burns wood, most of which she chops up from timber and logs found in a storage shed, and some of which she gathers. 2.5 years in, she still hasn't had to fell trees herself. She looks forward anxiously to the time when she will have run out of matches and ammunition, and these are coming back to Ben's paper, technologies, which we could then come back to in the discussion. The calculation of how much time remains with these technologies bookends the novel. Wenn die Zeit ohne Feuer und ohne Munition kommen wird, werde ich mich mit ihr befassen und einen Ausweg suchen. In a circular economy, it is important for the circles not to be drawn too tight. See quote 1 on this slide. Neben dem Stall wuchs langsam der Misthaufen an. Ich hatte vor, mit ihm im Herbst den Erdapfelacker zu düngen. So this is a circularity of the economy. So she will use the waste of Bella and Stier. Rund um den Misthaufen wucherten riesige Brennnesseln, eine unausrottbare Plage. Andererseits war ich immer auf der Suche nach jungen Nesseln für meinen Spinat. Das einzige Gemüse, das es hier gab, and she often refers to the fact that she doesn't have enough green stuff in her diet. Ich mochte aber die Misthaufennnesseln nicht dazu verwenden. Ich glaube, das war ein dummes Vorurteil. Es ist mir bis heute nicht gelungen, es abzulegen. But remember, this is the Bericht, and the narration time is not the end in a sense. It looks forward, and she may overcome this Vorurteil in due course. Finally, what are the implications of a metabolic reading for a feminist reading of this classic feminist text? The metabolic reading, which attends to energy regimes and material and energetic flows in the context of the ecocidal Anthropocene, will inevitably take a different view of cyclicality and circularity than that found in classical feminism. Simone de Beauvoir writes, famously, few tasks are more like the torture of Sisyphus than housework with its endless repetition. The clean becomes soiled, the soiled is made clean, over and over, day after day. The housewife wears herself out marking time. She makes nothing, simply perpetuates the present. And this endless repetition, the Sisyphean reproductive labor of which Simone de Beauvoir is so critical, reading it as the trap of immanence from which women have to be liberated. It is present, I think, on every page of the novel. It's not a household in the limited sense, but it's a closed circular economy in which the labor of self-reproduction dominates every waking minute almost. So what is the relationship here between the feminist analysis and the metabolic reading? Haushofer's novel begins the work, I would suggest, of transvaluing the terms of Beauvoir's analysis. What was for Beauvoir the prison of immanence must become something else for an ecological feminist sensibility in the Anthropocene amidst the ruins of the industrial growth society. Haushofer's narrative of a circular economy enables us to imagine possibilities beyond the metabolic rift, allowing us to see the work of the sustenance economy bound up more closely with nature's economy. And here I'm drawing on Vandana Shiva's tripartite division as outlined in her book Earth Democracy, where she talks about nature's economy, the market economy, and the sustenance economy. In Shiva's model, nature's economy is mined for sources of extra-human energy, from soil, plant, and animal life to fossil fuels and minerals. The market economy determines the use and distribution of this energy by and among humans. In the sustenance economy, the focus is on the energetic dimension of humans themselves, humans who become tired and must rest, hungry and must eat, dirty and must wash, lonely, we just heard it in Ben's paper, and must seek fellowship. Haushofer's protagonist, and this she has in common with other protagonists of feminist literary fiction of the time. I'm in a longer version of this paper. I relate this to Morgner, Doris Lessing, Chantal Ackermann, and Christa Wolf. So Haushofer's protagonist then is constantly engaged in creating the conditions for the reproduction of her own bodily existence and that of her companion animals. The work that occupies her days is the work of life-making, and that's a term I'm drawing from Jason Moore. Divand presents to us the repurposed hunting lodge and its multi-species family as a household in which nature's economy bypasses the now defunct market economy and is directly taken up by the sustenance economy in a self-contained system in which there are cycles of change and processes of self-transformation, but no net growth. Perhaps one of the many revolutions the current apocalypse demands is that we reread Beauvoir's Sisyphus in conjunction with that of Camus. who insisted on imagining Sisyphus as happily rolling his stone. And I hadn't been aware until I started work on this paper that Daniela Striegel's essay on Die Wand from 2004 also takes up Camus' reading of Sisyphus. The ecocidal context of the Great Acceleration urges a rethinking of the Sisyphean labor of reproduction and care. A shift from Beauvoir's Sisyphus imprisoned and in torment to Sisyphus Serenissimus would require the kind of revolution in consciousness which Haushofer's novel begins to suggest. Mein neues Ich, langsam von einem größeren Wir aufgesogen, a quote we've often heard in the past few days. This would involve a fundamental reevaluation of Beauvoir's Elle perpétue seulement le présent. So she simply perpetuates the present. Dot has crept in there. So no longer that to which we are condemned, the perpetuation of life becomes that with which we have been entrusted, again, Haushofer's anvertraut. This would overturn the assumption that reproductive labor does not produce anything, elle ne fait rien. The perpetuation of a present that does not come at the price of its own future would finally become appreciable as the vast task that it is, as the Anthropocene's greatest challenge. Haushofer's novel helps us to imagine that task in all its ambivalence. Thank you. I'll stop there.